For children and young people everywhere in the world, one of the first things that they look forward to or makes them excited is school.
Schools need to be a place of safety for children and must be free of all forms of discrimination. Tragically, young people face serious violations of their human rights within the classroom, including their rights to sexual and reproductive health.
Especially girls from the low-income communities, you find that, first of all, there are perpetrators in the community. Safety and security is a big issue. Menstrual health, hygiene and stigma around menstrual health is a big issue. You find girls from low-income communities not being able to access education fully because of such issues.
Learners experience 3 central sexual and reproductive health issues at school: menstruation, sexual violence, and discrimination against pregnant learners. All of these issues are aggravated by the lack of comprehensive sexuality education. These are issues of human rights. Everyone has the right to gender equality, education and health, and no one should be prevented from learning on account of their unmet sexual and reproductive health needs. This episode will explore how these problems arise and how a human rights framework can assist in tackling them. The first issue is menstruation. The cultural stigma around this topic not only restricts girls' access to information, but often results in bullying and harassment at school.
For girls especially, when they get into their teenagers and they start to experience the changes and they start asking a lot of questions, usually parents tend not to answer. And even teachers, if they don't have the knowledge or experience, they may not be able to, provide the answers. There's a lot of stigma, and in a community or society where it's almost something that you do not talk about, it leaves a lot of the girls in a cage.
You find even the fellow students, stigmatized. Like we have mixed school, the boys, find it kind of crazy that you're menstruating,
Other students and pupils make fun of them. It lowers their esteem. Some want to change school, some even drop out of school.
So we need a bit of sensitization in schools around these issues.
Challenging the stigma and bullying around menstruation depends partly on successful comprehensive sexuality education. Having open and candid conversations about menstruation with both girls and boys can help to create an environment where menstruation is not seen as strange or shameful. But a key part of girls' difficulties with menstruation is that for those in poverty, sanitary items are often simply too expensive.
We do find that, especially in poor rural places, girls cannot even afford sanitary towels. So you find that when the time for menstruation comes, it's a nightmare for a girl. So the policies around that are lacking. We need support for things like free sanitary towels for the girls in schools.
We don't have information about it. It's known that there are issues there, and particularly poor girls do not go to school when they have their periods. But there's not enough documentation.
Without clear documentation, this situation often isn't taken seriously, and there are very few policies in place to provide sanitary items for learners. Some organisations are directly providing sanitary towels to those who need them, but as long as provision of sanitary items is seen as non-essential, as something to be tackled by charity rather than as a human right, girls will be left vulnerable. Not only are they not provided, they are often taxed as luxury items. One way that advocates are beginning to change this situation is by tackling the so-called tampon tax.
There was a recent decision of the Colombian Constitutional Court that stated that imposing taxes on tampons and pads was a discriminatory practice because of access for women of different backgrounds.
Litigation has the power to establish in law that girls have a right to access sanitary items, and that this functions as part of their right to education. This is a strong foundation upon which to base further advocacy on menstruation. But even with adequate sanitary supplies, girls still need clean, safe toilet facilities in order to attend school while menstruating.
We're seeing schools where there are not only too few toilets, but toilets that have very bad infrastructure. They'll just be corrugated boxes. We have pit latrines. A pit latrine is a hole in the ground. It's really shocking that learners are expected to use these facilities. Girl learners, particularly in times of menstruation, are not going to come to school or really have significant challenges with these kind of conditions. And I think that these are adding to learners dropping out or high absenteeism. There is an emphasis on infrastructure, there's an emphasis on the fact that there's no sanitation, but we don't always emphasize the way that this affects particularly the female learner, and that this could come down to a form of discrimination against them in particular.
Demi Schell and her organisation have been advocating on this issue in the South African Parliament, trying to bring about regulations that would legally require schools to have adequate toilet facilities, as well as other essential infrastructure.
Equal education has received a really great victory. In November 2013, the Minister of Basic Education published these regulations.
Getting regulations in place was only the first step, however, and Equal Education has more recently been pushing for implementation of these regulations.
Noting the challenges with implementation of this regulation, and also noting the constant submissions by the state that resources are few, that they don't have the budget for this. What the Law Centre is doing and what Equal Education is doing is just continuously raising this issue, continuously interrogating the way money is spent. It's just important that when going to Parliament, when standing before parliamentary committees, to continuously raise this issue and to actually interrogate budgets and to see how money is being spent and how it's being allocated, and to not be afraid to work in that realm as well with the state.
Girls also experience sexual violence in school. This is a gross violation of their rights to education, health, gender equality, and security of the person, and is again aggravated by the lack of comprehensive sexuality education.
The girls face a lot of perpetrators in terms of the school context, and so you find a lot of dropouts and a lot of girls also going through a lot of traumatic experiences that would be avoided if they had guidance.
Francis's experiences teaching CSE in Ghana speak to the power of engaging girls and boys in conversations about sex and consent.
The boys ask questions about rape, about how they could avoid a lot of girls quote unquote trapping them, a lot of issues that boys were facing but they could not even talk about. In a very fun environment where there is interactive theater, where you see a guy try to get a girl accept his advances and all of that. And then we ask the boys, fine, if you were him, what would you do differently? And they come and they act it out. So it's not only a one-way thing about engaging with the girls and how to negotiate or how to avoid pregnancies while in school or STIs, but it also gives the boys voice.
This is another way in which comprehensive sexuality education can improve sexual and reproductive health rights at school. However, often the danger comes not just from their peers and from adults in the communities, but from the teachers. In such cases, it's essential to hold to account not only the teachers themselves, but also the structures that allowed them to endanger children in the first place.
A case that was quite interesting is where one of the judges, she did find a ruling against the Teacher Service Commission, the commission that is responsible for hiring teachers, asking them that they must take responsibility. When the teachers impregnate the girls, that means the system has failed. And okay, what they do is they blacklist the teachers and they are always removed from the payroll. But we think that is not enough. So the court did find the Teacher Service Commission culpable, and they were ordered to pay compensation to the girls who had gotten pregnant while in school.
In this case, the Teachers Service Commission, a part of the Kenyan government, was held responsible. And in 2018, they released strict guidelines on preventing rape in schools. The Kenyan example demonstrates that the state can and should be held accountable when human rights violations happen in publicly funded schools. But what about when this occurs in private schools? The state is still ultimately responsible for any human rights violations that take place in its jurisdiction. This responsibility recently became relevant in Liberia. In 2016, Liberia outsourced its primary school education to private providers, but put in place no monitoring mechanism to ensure that rights were upheld within these schools. In 2019, the co-founder of one of these private providers was discovered to be systematically abusing students.
A massive scandal was unearthed of a lot of sexual violence against the students who were in the school that the management knew about, or at least had an opportunity to know about, and did not take the steps that they should have taken to protect the children.
The responsibility for this lies ultimately with the government, who must put mechanisms in place to ensure that human rights are upheld, even in private institutions. One key legal resource that can be drawn upon in the context of privatization of education is the Abidjan Principles.
We're starting the dissemination phase of the Abidjan Principles on the right to education, which are a set of principles that compile and unpack what the state should do to ensure that the right to education is fully realized, particularly in light of the growing presence of the private sector in education. Once the Abidjan Principles are fully disseminated and people understand them, we're hoping that first states will draw from them a lot to inform strategies to implement the right to education, including providing public schools and regulating private schools effectively. And communities will have one more tool that they can use to hold government accountable, to hold private sector accountable, and to demand for their rights.
The third issue is the rights of pregnant learners in school, who are often expelled, mistreated, and for whom limited accommodation or even acknowledgement is made.
If you are pregnant, you are expelled from school. There are no policies to allow you to be pregnant when you are in school or when you're breastfeeding. There is no go zone here.
And along with that is learners not being told when they can come back to school. When they do come back to school, there's no catch-up plan to help them catch up with the work they've lost. So it's almost as if pregnancy is treated as like a crime, that learners are punished. There's still this idea that she has done something bad and needs to pay for that, or should not be in a school with other learners because it's a bad example. Unfortunately, it's also about schools not knowing what the law says, that every learner has a right to a basic education, and that we have the right to equality and non-discrimination, and that they're not understanding what this means for learners.
Demichelle and her colleagues at Equal Education have brought litigation on behalf of pregnant learners who were expelled. In the Welkom and Harmony High Schools case, they drew upon the constitutional right to education and the right to non-discrimination, to demand that pregnant learners are treated with respect and are allowed to continue learning during and after pregnancy. The Welkom and Harmony High Schools had a policy that did not allow pregnant learners to return to school until a year after they had given birth.
Their policies were challenged because this was discriminating against learners, especially if they were fit and able to return back to school. The Constitutional Court held in their favour, and they had to revise these policies.
Following this case, Equal Education worked with the government to put in place a policy to ensure that pregnant learners would not be discriminated against. However, they have had to keep monitoring the implementation of this policy and following up with government.
Having a link with the civil society movement is great in that they can go into schools and see whether things on the ground are changing, whether attitudes are changing, if discrimination is still happening. And unfortunately, the Department of Education has taken a very long time to implement this. We were corresponding with them often about ways that they're letting schools know that this should happen, because these violations are caused by school principals, by school governing bodies. They're the ones that are making these decisions that discriminate against pregnant learners. And despite the fact that there is a Constitutional Court judgment that has said that learners should not be discriminated against, it still seems that these issues are arising. And a lot of this could just be because the department is not making this clear, that there is not sufficient training with principals and school governing bodies and department officials that this is actually a violation.
Another important strategy is to raise awareness amongst learners of their human rights, so that they are empowered to speak out against unfair school policies.
We try and make clear that this right to basic education includes their access to education, and that it's unlawful to exclude a learner on the basis of being pregnant, and that this really comes down to discrimination against learners. So that's a really important message that we want to send to pregnant learners. And I think it's important for them to know that the law protects them like this because of the stigmas that they have to face, that there is a strong legal hold for them to say, I have a right to be at school, I have a right to a basic education, despite what the community or the school may think. Sometimes a learner may feel intimidated by the fact that you have to challenge a principal or challenge a school governing body or challenge a school policy. And I think it's really crucial that they be empowered with information about the law and what may and may not happen.
These are some of the challenges that children and adolescents, particularly girls, face in school regarding their sexual and reproductive health, and some of the ways that advocates are trying to tackle such issues. More than just a lofty goal, this is a human rights obligation and forms a core component of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Sustainable Development Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Having this goal translate into a constitution that now obliges the government to have a right to education, then means we can actually frame it. Because the goal gives us a framing. What does a lifelong opportunity mean? What does quality education mean? And since we can refer to this when we're arguing for constitutional rights, it gives us a way to frame our argument. So it's very important to have something to work towards and to be able to frame the state obligation in a way that makes sense. Not just saying, give us free education, we're saying, this is what it means for you to meet your right. It has to be quality, it has to be sustainable, it has to be lifelong. What are you doing towards this aspect of it?